understand why the United States went to war to get California, just fly through its ancient forests, where you can peer up at the tallest trees on Earth, float down on volcanic forms that can take your breath away, and race along a lost coast that can make you feel like you've discovered paradise. But the beauty of Northern California's majestic landscapes can be deceiving. Deep below are still powerful forces that remain the greatest threats to life above. It was in California's snowy peaks that the famous Donner Party suffered one of the worst tragedies in the history of the American West. And here, years of drought have threatened to destroy a central valley that's one of the agricultural wonders of the world. But no matter what forces nature sends their way, Californians have endured thanks to the promise of the frontier. It was here where hopeful American settlers stood their ground against Mexican rule, where one man's chance discovery in a creek triggered hundreds of thousands to make a mad rush for gold, and where a new generation of marijuana growers is testing the limits of the law high in the infamous Emerald Triangle. It was on a hill overlooking a bay that a once tiny Spanish mission gave birth to one of America's great cities, with its famous cable cars and winding streets. The marvels of this Pacific Coast state can seem endless, from its giant dams to its bridges and the vast new headquarters of its Silicon Valley giants. All this in the northern half of the Golden State, California. There's a place in Northern California where it's possible to imagine what the Pacific Coast was like long before it was crowded with humans. It's a remote stretch of shoreline where rugged mountains plunge right down to the sea. There's nothing else like it anywhere in California. It's the only place where there aren't any highways close to the water. And that's one reason it's called the Lost Coast. Here, come summer, seals gather on its rocky beaches, and mother gray whales raise their young in these clear, green Pacific waters. These are just two of the many species that cling to the North American continent's western edge. This stretch of the Lost Coast is part of the King Range National Conservation Area, created by Congress in 1970. To get here, hikers take a 25-mile trail. But when the tide comes in, they have to be careful. It's easy to get trapped on the beach under the cliffs and then washed out to sea. But while this may provide a glimpse of what California was probably like thousands of years ago, it wasn't always this uninhabited. In fact, after humans arrived in North America, the area that's now California was one of the most populated regions of the United States, probably because of its mild climate. It was home to a wide range of tribes who fished its waters and traded with each other. But their ways of life and the land itself were radically transformed starting in the 16th century. That's when Spanish and British navigators first began exploring California's shore and claiming vast stretches of it as their own. The Spanish sailed up the California coast as early as 1542. But it wasn't until the 18th century that they began constructing a series of missions here. They built their sixth mission in what's now San Francisco. It was given the name Mission de San Francisco de Asís, but is better known as Mission Dolores. This adobe-style mission dates back to 1791 and is the oldest intact building in San Francisco today. It survived centuries of change and even major earthquakes. In 1918, a much larger basilica was built next door. The Spaniards used their missions to convert Native Americans to Christianity and help the Spanish settle and dominate the region. The town that grew up around the old mission went on to become San Francisco, which was named after this now tiny Spanish church. But the Spanish didn't hold on to California for long. In 1821, Mexico won its independence from Spain. The vast Spanish colony of Alta California soon became a province of Mexico. In 1839, a Swiss immigrant named John Sutter arrived and managed to convince the Mexican governor to give him almost 50,000 acres of land to create a settlement he called New Switzerland. He also convinced Indians from the area to help him build a fort, which came to be known as Sutter's Fort, and a major destination for American settlers who started arriving in Alta California. But over time, Mexican authorities became suspicious of the Americans and threatened to kick them out if they didn't become Mexican citizens. In June 1846, fearful that they were about to be expelled, a few Americans in the region decided to revolt. They launched an assault on the town of Sonoma. Calling themselves Osos, Spanish for bears, they took a Mexican general hostage, seized control of a local barracks here, and raised their own flag with the image of a grizzly bear on it and the words, California Republic. Their action would be known as the Bear Flag Revolt. Today, the California state flag has the image of a grizzly bear on it and still reads California Republic to honor those early American settlers who had stood their ground here on California soil. But their self-declared republic lasted less than a month. U.S. President James K. Polk desperately wanted California for the U.S., and so he tried to buy it from Mexico for $20 million. The Mexicans refused to sell, which was one reason the U.S. went to war with Mexico in May 1846. During that war, California continued to lure American settlers, even though the journey they had to take to get here could be treacherous. To reach the safety of Sutter's Fort, travelers first had to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains that straddle California's border with Nevada. Today, Amtrak's California Zephyr carries passengers over these mountains every day on its journey between Chicago, Illinois and Emeryville, California. It's the longest route by a single train in the entire Amtrak system. The trip covers more than 2,400 miles and takes more than 2 days. On its journey west, the Zephyr passes through the town of Truckee and then up and over the Donner Pass. This pass was named for a now infamous group of settlers who tried to cross the Sierras on foot long before there was a rail line or even any kind of paved road. What happened to them here would go down as one of the greatest tragedies in the history of the American West. In October 1846, a group of 87 settlers, known as the Donner Party, finally reached the eastern edge of the Sierras. They and their wagon train were weeks behind schedule. They had taken bad advice and gotten bogged down crossing the famous salt flats of Utah on what was supposed to be a shortcut. As they started to make their way into the mountains, winter was approaching, and snow was already falling a month earlier than usual. Soon, they found themselves fighting the worst winter in the Sierra's history. Trapped by the snow on the high passes, they set camp here, near a body of water that's now known as Donner Lake. They were forced to remain here and wait for a chance to make it over the mountains and to safety at Sutter's Fort. Deep snow and hostile members of the Paiute tribe made it too dangerous to return the way they had come. The snow kept falling. In some places, it reached depths of up to 20 feet. Help didn't arrive. By mid-December 1846, the Donner Party's food supplies were dwindling. On December 16th, a member of their party died from starvation, the first of many. They had already killed and eaten their own oxen, and then even boiled the oxen's hides to make a glue-like substance they hoped would give them nourishment. When the men headed off into the forests near the lake to hunt, they often returned empty-handed. Archaeologists have discovered that they ate twigs, bark, and rodents to survive. Finally, 15 of the strongest members of the group decided one last time to try to cross the mountains. But the snow held them back yet again. Stranded on the high passes, they ran out of food entirely. When members of the group died, the others are believed to have resorted to cannibalism to survive. Of the 87 immigrants who had set out from Illinois, only 46 survived the journey. One of the youngest was 8-year-old Patty Reed. She managed to carry a doll with her through the mountains, which is on display here at Sutter's Fort. Little did she and the others who survived the journey know that they were about to witness one of the greatest events in the history of the nation, the California Gold Rush. In 1848, 2 years after the Donner Party's tragedy in the Sierra Nevada mountains, the U.S. signed a treaty ending its war with Mexico, which agreed to cede a vast area of the West to the U.S. government, including all the land that's now present-day California. It amounted to a third of the United States' current territory, but it came at a cost. 13,000 American soldiers had died in the war. One year later, in 1849, thousands of people started pouring into California, stricken with gold fever. It all started when John Sutter and a carpenter named James Marshall were building a sawmill 45 miles northeast of Sutter's Fort, here in Coloma. On January 24, 1848, Marshall noticed glints of gold in the water flowing through the mill's tail race. Soon, California's gold rush was on. Marshall's finding led to the largest mass movement of people in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Hundreds of thousands of would-be millionaires were soon doing whatever they could to get to California so they could slosh around in its waterways and search for treasure. The town around Sutter's Fort became a supply depot for the miners and was transformed into a boom town called Sacramento. The next year, in 1850, California was made America's 31st state. It went directly to statehood. Unlike many other states, California was never a territory. Sacramento was made its new capital. By 1860, a new state house was rising in the center of town, modeled after the U.S. Capitol in Washington. It's been home to two movie stars turned governors, Ronald Reagan in 1967 and Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2003. Both held court here in the State House for 2 four-year terms. When Schwarzenegger left office in 2011, California's economy was the 9th largest in the world, bigger even than Russia's. But the shining gold ball atop the Capitol's dome is a reminder of what first kicked off the state's economic boom and how it got its nickname, the Golden State. California grew rapidly after statehood. In 1869, Sacramento became the endpoint of the nation's new transcontinental railroad, which finally knitted the nation together east to west for the first time. The days of settlers having to drive their wagon trains up and over the snowy Sierras were finally over. At the time, San Francisco was already a major port, but large ranches still covered much of the land around San Francisco Bay. It looked a lot like this region today, the stunning Mendocino Hills, north of San Francisco. This kind of landscape once covered much of the Bay Area. But over time, buildings rose, communities grew, and cities took hold. That's also how Silicon Valley got its start. In 1884, the former governor of California, Leland Stanford, and his wife Jane decided to found a university on a ranch they owned here, south of San Francisco. They did it to honor their young son, who had died from typhoid. Stanford University was finally ready to open its doors to students in 1891. The center of the campus is the Quad, designed in the Romanesque style by architect H.H. Richardson. Leland Stanford also added elements used in Spanish missions, including red tile roofs and arched corridors. Together, they make the Stanford campus one of the most distinctive in the world. The school's iconic and more modern-looking Hoover Tower was named after President Herbert Hoover, who was a Stanford grad. So was quarterback John Elway and Sally Ride, the first American woman to enter space. But it's the glass and steel of the David Packard Building and adjacent Hewlett Teaching Center, funded by 2 Stanford graduates, that tell the story of how this part of California became Silicon Valley. In 1939, Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard formed a company to make audio equipment. A coin flip determined that the company name would start with Hewlett, not Packard. HP quickly grew. Soon, the area around Stanford became a hub of innovation, where scientists and engineers invented everything from transistor radios to semiconductors to microchips. In 1971, a journalist coined the term Silicon Valley to describe what was happening here. But it was in the 1990s that Silicon Valley's current tech boom really got started. In 1994, 2 Stanford graduate students formed Yahoo by creating what they called Jerry and David's Guide to the World Wide Web. And then in 1998, 2 other graduate students, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, created the search algorithm that would be the foundation of their new company, Google. Today, Google's headquarters is this vast campus known as the Googleplex. But back in 1998, when they were just getting started, Google's founders had their first office in a garage at this house in Menlo Park. They were following what's practically a Silicon Valley tradition. In the mid-1970s, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak also started off in a small house and garage of their own in Los Altos, where they built their first Apple computers. It's still owned by members of Jobs' family. Facebook is also now headquartered in Silicon Valley, but it wasn't started in a local garage. A few hackers at Harvard created Facebook in a dorm room and later moved to California to reap the rewards from all the tech talent and venture capital here. Evidence of just how much money there is here in this one corner of California is easy to spot from the air in nearby Cupertino. This construction site will soon be the new Apple headquarters. It was designed by British star architect Norman Foster, who envisioned it as a giant solar-powered glass ring with an elaborate park in the center. Due to open in 2016, it will house 13,000 employees and be about 2/3 the size of the Pentagon. Bloggers have dubbed it simply the spaceship. Northern California is full of spectacles of human ingenuity, from the massive headquarters of its high-tech giants to San Francisco's stunning skyline, from the cable cars that climb its hills to the famous streets that wind right down them. But there's no man-made spectacle in Northern California as dramatic as this: the Golden Gate Bridge. Come late spring and summer, San Francisco's famous coastal cloud bank hangs over this engineering marvel and the entrance to San Francisco Bay like a blanket. The fog, known as a marine layer, starts offshore and then is sucked into the bay by warmer air that rises over California's Central Valley. It turns the Golden Gate Bridge into one of the most dramatic sights in all of California, if not the nation. Back in 1579, Sir Francis Drake, the first Englishman ever to sail up the California coast, missed the entrance to San Francisco Bay, probably because of a fog bank like this one. These days, clear mornings can be hard to find during San Francisco's summers. But often, in the middle of the day, the fog disappears, and the Golden Gate Bridge is as clear as day. And that makes the job of captains on giant container ships like this one a whole lot easier. All day, every day, these ships pass under the bridge on their way to and from the port of Oakland. On their way, they pass by Angel Island, the largest natural island in San Francisco Bay. Some have called it the Ellis Island of the West. Starting in 1910, thousands of immigrants from Asia were processed here. But unlike Ellis Island in New York Harbor, which welcomed immigrants from around the world, Angel Island was actually used to restrict their entry into the country. In 1882, the U.S. Congress, responding to large-scale unemployment at the time, passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese citizens from coming to America. It was later extended to cover those from other Asian countries. Angel Island soon came to be known as the guardian of the Western Gate. A new immigration facility was built here and was where many Chinese were held for days, weeks, and even months at a time in crowded conditions before being either allowed in or deported back across the Pacific. Those harsh laws came to an end in 1943. Many of those detained on Angel Island probably felt like they'd been sent here, to California's most notorious prison, San Quentin, which lies within sight of Angel Island. It was built in 1852 to curb the lawlessness that arrived with the gold rush. Today, it's home to California's controversial new lethal injection death chamber, which was built under Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger at a cost of nearly $900,000. Since 1976, California has executed 13 death row inmates, 11 of those by lethal injection. But San Quentin is also famous for its sports. Once a year, players from the NBA's Golden State Warriors in Oakland come to San Quentin to face off on the court against a team made up of San Quentin inmates. Over the years, this facility has housed many of California's most notorious prisoners, from Charles Manson to country music great Merle Haggard. In 1957, when Haggard was 18, he was sent to San Quentin on a burglary charge. It was here where he saw Johnny Cash perform live, which he says inspired him to become a singer when he got out 2 years later. In 1968, Cash decided to record a live album at another California prison known as Folsom State, northeast of Sacramento. That album, called At Folsom Prison, went gold. It also turned Cash's song Folsom Prison Blues into a #1 hit on the country music charts. It lies right at the base of the massive Folsom Dam. But prisoners are lucky if they get a glimpse of the waters of Folsom Lake or its sandy shores. This western region of Northern California has some of the state's most iconic landscapes. The still waters of its Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, rows of crops that follow the delta's course, and even the brilliant blue waters of Lake Tahoe and its stunning Emerald Bay. From the air, the variety of California's landscapes appear to be endless. But sometimes, they are not quite what they seem. These colorful formations north of Sacramento are a perfect example. At first, these formations in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains look like California's version of the Grand Canyon. It would be easy to imagine that wind, rain, and time were the sole forces that exposed these ancient layers of earth. But in fact, if nature had been able to work its wonders here, this landscape wouldn't exist at all. That's because these colorful hills were actually created by one of the most destructive industrial practices in the world. It's called hydraulic mining. When the gold of California's famous 1849 gold rush started to run out, miners began doing whatever they could to get the trace deposits that remained out of the mountains. The town of North Bloomfield is where many came to search for treasure. Buildings from that time still stand here today in what amounts now to a ghost town. The way miners here dug for gold was to funnel water from nearby streams and rivers into a web of pipes, and then direct powerful jets of water at the hillsides to wash away the earth and rock and reveal the gold. It was fast, but highly destructive, and turned this entire valley into a wasteland of mining pits. The site is known today as Malakoff Diggings. Equipment still litters the valley. Silt and tailings from hydraulic mining clogged streams, flooded towns and farms, and even turned San Francisco Bay muddy brown. In 1884, a judge ruled that the polluting of the waterways by hydraulic mining had to stop. It was one of the very first environmental laws ever passed in the nation. But more than a century and a half later, the natural landscape of Malakoff Diggings has yet to recover. In their relentless search for gold, and with an insatiable appetite to turn California's rich land into farms, miners and settlers began putting pressure on California's native tribes. One of those was the Modoc. Their tragic story came to a head here, in what's now known as the Lava Beds National Monument in Northern California. In 1873, the Modoc retreated here and used the tunnels in the lava to evade and attack the federal forces who were trying to force them onto a reservation in Oregon. They were so successful that for a while, 60 members of the tribe held off an assault by a federal force of 600. The area of lava beds where they hid is called Captain Jack's Stronghold, after the tribe's chief, Kintapus, better known as Captain Jack. In the spring of 1873, U.S. General Edward R. Canby arrived here to try and negotiate the Modoc surrender. Captain Jack didn't trust the general, but still argued for peace. But other Modoc warriors outvoted him, and he ended up shooting Canby in the face and then slitting his throat. A cross to honor Canby now stands near the site where he died. On it are written the words, "General Canby, USA, was murdered here by the Modocs, April 11, 1873. He was the only general killed during the nation's Indian Wars." Not far away, members of the Modoc tribe have raised a medicine flag to honor their chief. Captain Jack was finally captured, tried, and hanged for killing Canby. He and 2 other Modoc warriors were the only Native Americans ever to be convicted as war criminals. To this day, many consider him a hero who defended his people in a time when the U.S. was forcing many tribes to give up vast stretches of their land for almost nothing at what amounted to gunpoint. After the events here, the surviving members of the tribe were sent to Oklahoma, where some of their descendants still live today. Meanwhile, immigrant settlers moved in and took control of Native American lands. They turned grasslands into fields and farms. California's Central Valley is a testament to those efforts. Between the state's mountain ranges is a vast prairie that stretches across an area 450 miles long and up to 60 miles wide. Settlers began turning this Central Valley into what it is today, one of the most productive regions of the world, with its fields of asparagus, artichokes, almonds, apples, and much more. It's been called the land of a billion vegetables. Close to 25% of the nation's food comes from this one valley. In good years, the Central Valley's fields are fed with water from the surrounding mountains, including those of one of the valley's most successful crops, rice. Worldwide demand for rice has risen so fast that farmers can hardly keep up. That's one reason they seed their fields by plane. Come April and May, California farmers north of Sacramento plant more rice using aircraft than any other place in the world. Swooping and circling, these daredevil pilots evoke the stunt circus flyers of the early 20th century. Farmers have been seeding their fields with planes since the 1920s. it's not a job for the faint of heart. These fields may seem endless, but California's rice farmers know well that they can't take the water they get for granted. In fact, in 2014 alone, roughly $1.25 billion worth of rice won't be able to be planted due to California's drought. There's just not enough water to flood every field. California's 2013 drought was the worst in its history and turned many farms in the Central Valley into fields of dry dirt. Some farmers now rely on wells drilled directly into the aquifer below their farms, since there's not enough supply from the surrounding mountains. Getting water to Central Valley farms and to homes and businesses across the state has been a problem for California for more than a century. In 1938, the federal government decided to try and solve the problem with an engineering marvel known as the Shasta Dam. In the U.S., it's second in size only to Hoover Dam on the Nevada-Arizona border. It's one of many dams in what's called the Central Valley Project. Standing 602 feet tall on a base of concrete that's more than 800 feet thick, it holds back the waters of the Sacramento River in a giant reservoir called Shasta Lake. But this lake is not what it used to be. When water levels in the Sacramento River drop due to the drought, so too did the water in Shasta Lake, which is why its shore looks like a giant bathtub ring. Many other dams and reservoirs in the state have fared much worse. Rising high above the Shasta Dam is one of the most prized sights in Northern California, the snow-covered peak of Mount Shasta itself. It's the second highest mountain in the Cascades Range after Washington State's Mount Rainier. It rises 14,000 feet above the plains. So much of the Northern California landscape stirs the imagination. Whether it's snow-capped volcanic peaks, wild, rugged coastline, or even the wonder of its Central Valley. But nothing comes close to the experience of floating through a forest of ancient California redwoods, especially when the tops of the trees tower hundreds of feet over your head. Here, in the Redwood National and State Parks, in California's northwest corner, streams wind through a primeval forest where redwoods first took root thousands of years ago and still reach skyward. No other living creature grows quite as tall as a redwood. One tree in this forest tops out at 380 feet, more than 70 feet higher than the Statue of Liberty. It's the tallest tree in the world, but its location is a well-guarded secret. Redwoods can survive for up to 2,000 years, and the trunks can reach 26 feet across. That is, if loggers don't get to them first. Centuries ago, towering redwood forests blanketed Northern California. But today, less than 5% of those original trees remain. The destruction of these soaring natural treasures began when gold seekers arrived and started cutting down redwood trees to build new homes and mills. One of the biggest logging companies was owned by a Canadian entrepreneur named William Carson, who arrived in 1852 with a team of oxen to start logging redwoods here. He shipped tens of thousands of feet of redwood lumber out of Humboldt Bay, near the coastal town of Eureka, to San Francisco and beyond. By 1884, Carson was a timber tycoon and rich enough to build this enormous Queen Anne-style mansion in Eureka, designed by two famous San Francisco architects. It was built from, not surprisingly, redwood, and almost 100,000 feet of white mahogany he had shipped in from Central America. Today, it's the home of a private club. In 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Redwood National Park into existence. Today, the National Park Service and the state of California oversee about 100,000 acres of redwood forests under protection. The Redwood State and National Parks lie in an area known as the Emerald Triangle. It covers the California counties of Trinity, Humboldt, and Mendocino. There are not many redwoods left in these hills, but there is plenty of cash thanks to another modern-day gold rush, or as many call it, a green rush. Fly over just about any hill in the Emerald Triangle today, and you'll spot a greenhouse full of leafy green marijuana plants. Mendocino County is often called the marijuana capital of the nation. Grow houses are everywhere, and often they're huge. People began coming to this part of California to grow marijuana in the 1960s. They sold their weed on the illegal market and lived quiet, laid-back lives. But now, there's a brash new generation of pot growers here. Locals complain that they're barging into the woods, cutting down too many trees, and destroying the ecosystem. A single pot plant can consume up to 6 gallons of water a day. Some growers are willing to do whatever it takes to keep their plants alive, whether it's drilling illegal wells or secretly tapping the local water supply. The state of California permits residents to grow marijuana for their own medicinal use, which is how most growers here justify what they're up to. But a single grow of just 20 plants can be worth up to $250,000 on the street, which is why drug cartels from Mexico and Russia are also operating here in the Emerald Triangle. But growing weed is still a federal crime, which is why many growers live in fear of DEA agents descending from the sky in helicopters, or that members of the cartels will raid their farms at gunpoint just before the harvest. Local authorities estimate that half the people in Mendocino County are employed by the weed industry. On the evening of October 17, 1989, more than 60,000 baseball fans were getting settled in at San Francisco's Candlestick Park and eagerly awaiting the first pitch of Game 3 of the World Series. It was part of the Battle of the Bay, the famous rivalry of two Bay Area teams, the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland Athletics. But at 5:04 p.m., just a half hour before the game was scheduled to start, the stadium suddenly started to tremble. The upper deck of the stands began to sway, and the ball field itself rolled like an ocean. It was an earthquake that was centered south of San Francisco, under the Loma Prieta peak of the Santa Cruz Mountains, located right on top of the San Andreas Fault. It sent shockwaves north and rocked the entire Bay Area for 15 seconds. The Loma Prieta quake registered 6.9 on the Richter scale and was the first earthquake to be broadcast on live television here at Candlestick Park. No one at the stadium was killed, but by the time the quake subsided, almost 4,000 people across the Bay Area had been injured. 63 were dead. Out on the Bay Bridge, which links Oakland and San Francisco, a section of the upper roadway broke free and fell onto the deck below. One driver there died. Not far away, here in Oakland, an even greater roadway collapse caused many more fatalities. At the time, a multi-lane double-decker freeway known as the Cypress Street Viaduct ran right through this neighborhood of West Oakland. But when the quake hit, the top deck of the freeway collapsed, causing 42 fatalities. Today, the viaduct is gone, and the site is now a park as a memorial to honor those who perished. The Loma Prieta quake was a wake-up call to officials that if another quake hit, much of Northern California's bridge and highway infrastructure wasn't ready. When the east span of the Bay Bridge was built in the 1930s, it was an engineering marvel for the time, the longest bridge of its kind in the world. But engineers knew that if another large quake hit, the Bay Bridge could suffer catastrophic failure. It ended up being a $6.4 billion problem. That's how much it cost to build a new, more earthquake-resistant bridge right next to the old one. Drivers were finally diverted onto its twin roadways on September 3, 2013, 24 years after the Loma Prieta quake rocked the San Francisco Bay Area. Today, its soaring 525-foot-high tower stands tall as an inspiring symbol of a region that took a shaking and got back up. One of the best ways to understand the terrifying power of the geological forces that exist under California is to travel north to a place known as Lassen Volcanic National Park. It was named after its dramatic centerpiece, a peak known as Mount Lassen. This stunning mountain formed more than 27,000 years ago. More recently, in 1915, a giant eruption from Lassen sent a mushroom cloud 5 miles into the sky. Volcanic ash rained down across hundreds of square miles. It remains an active volcano, thanks to the hot, churning forces that are still at work deep below its peak. Evidence of those forces can still be seen on the mountain's southern flanks. When water from rain and melted snow trickles down into molten rock in the volcano's core, it heats up and shoots right back to the surface, creating features known as steam vents, thumping mud pots and boiling pools. The steam in these vents can reach 322 degrees Fahrenheit. In the 1860s, a miner named Kendall Bumpus slipped into one of Lassen's boiling pools. He survived, but had to have his leg amputated. This area is now known as Bumpus Hell, as a warning to all to think twice about stepping off the walkway. Scientists believe that Lassen could erupt at any time. That's one reason geologists constantly monitor this volcano, so park rangers can work to get hikers like these off the mountain before it's too late. Over the last 300,000 years, there have been 30 different major eruptions in this volcanic region. These cataclysmic events have created some of the most impressive sights in all of Northern California. One of them is the beautifully smooth cinder cone. Multiple eruptions dating to about 1650 created this 700-foot-high formation. As particles and blobs of lava spewed out of this giant vent, they formed into a cone. Then, rivers of lava flowed out from the base of the cone, creating an area that's now known as the Fantastic Lava Beds. Trying to cross this rugged landscape on foot is not for the faint-hearted, which is why the best way to experience this hardened river of magma is from the air. California's location on top of an active volcanic zone is one reason this state has so many dramatic landscapes, but it's also partly responsible for one of Northern California's most famous crops. Here in the Napa Valley, volcanic deposits in the soil have helped create the perfect chemistry for growing award-winning grapes. Settlers first grew wine grapes here as far back as 1839. By 1900, there were more than 1,400 vineyards in the Napa Valley alone. But by 1920, a microscopic insect that attacks the root of the plants wiped out nearly 80% of Napa's vineyards. Then, Prohibition put them out of business entirely. After 1933, the vineyards started coming back. For years, the world dismissed California wines as second-rate. But that changed after an aspiring vintner named James L. Barrett bought an old vineyard here, restored it, and began replanting grapes in 1972. 4 years later, he dared to submit his Chardonnay to a blind taste test in Paris, France. The event was called the Judgment of Paris. Most of the judges were French, but when their blindfolds came off and their tallies were counted, Barrett's upstart California white wine made history. It beat out the French wines for first place. What was also amazing was that a red wine, a Cabernet from Napa's Stag's Leap winery, was the favorite in its category too. Wine experts were shocked. The French were enraged. Much of the French press even refused to report the story. But California vintners haven't looked back since. Today, there are more than 4,000 wineries in the state, and Americans now drink more than 650 million gallons of California wine a year. Some of it is even exported to France. The Napa Valley is just one small part of Northern California's rich history. A story driven by the hopeful spirit of its pioneers and their great discoveries, great tragedies, booms and busts. But through it all, the wonder of Northern California's landscape has endured. From the rugged wilderness of its lost tribes, across snow-capped mountains feared by early pioneers, to the tops of volcanic peaks that lure thrill seekers today. It may now be the most populated state in the nation, but it also has the wildest coast in the West. There is simply nothing like Northern California.